Welcome to sorry, I'm filling in for Leanna, who's in the back. We're session 24, the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, colonialism, Orientalism, and Eurocentrism. I'm Marcy Newman, and I wanted to just speak for a couple minutes, just in the spirit of comparing the U.S. and the Middle East about boycott, and also because we're going to be highlighting the U.S. academic and cultural boycott of Israel. Everyone will be getting handouts right now. One is a frequently asked question sheet about our movement, and then the other is the campaign that people sign when they want to endorse. And at the end of the session, we'll have a sign-up sheet. Hopefully people in here who haven't endorsed yet will be compelled to endorse. They will be inspired by your talk. I just wanted to say that you'll hear a lot about what we do in the States from our speakers today, but there are a few campaigns that we have in Lebanon, and the way we do boycott in Lebanon is quite different because we have a law here from 1955 that forbids any kind of normal relations with Israel. So there's no cooperation on the academic or cultural or economic front. So what we do in Lebanon, we have several things that are going on. One is we have an organization, an NGO now, that works to figure out who is violating this 1955 law and work to intervene. We also have economic campaigns that are targeting mostly American corporations that heavily invest in Israel. McDonald's, Coca-Cola, companies like this. We also have a cultural component where we look for musicians or artists who are going to Israel and then who want to come here afterwards and campaign to try to encourage them not to go there and to just come here, and letting them know that they're not welcome here after they are going to be performing there. We also have an academic boycott, and the academic boycott is very different than the one that they'll be talking about. We have, like I said, no cooperation whatsoever. It's illegal for us to do so. So that's just kind of to give people a frame of reference of how things differ. Lebanon is one of just two countries in the region that practices this. Just to give you an idea. And then there's one final campaign that we launched last year. It's a pink watching campaign that Nasawiyah, a feminist organization in Lebanon, helped to launch, that is basically looking for different kinds of violations of the boycott, specifically when Israel tries to pretend that they have a very gay-friendly country, and so we call attention to that, and we have a website for that. So these are kind of the different initiatives that are going on here in Lebanon. So with that, I'll pass it over to the panelists and let them introduce themselves before they speak. You all in a row right now?
No, as you for each before each topic.
Hello? Is that on? Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to be here. I want to start by thanking Majid Shihabi for organizing this panel and motivating me to get here, and thanks to Alex Lubin and the entire conference organizing team for this amazing meeting, and also for supporting my attendance here. My name is Kehalani Kawanui. I'm an associate professor at Wesleyan University, where I hold a joint appointment in both anthropology and American studies. And I work on contemporary indigenous politics. My area specialty is U.S. colonialism, and I do comparative work in Native America and the U.S. occupied Pacific Islands. My central focus of my work, my published work, is on Hawaii and contemporary Hawaiian nationalism and independence in light of Hawaiian histories of recognition throughout the 19th century as an independent state under international law. I also just want to mention that I am also an independent public affairs radio producer and host
And one of them, I raise it because both actually relate to the topic for me. One is a show I do with a collective, an anarchist radio collective called Horizontal Power Hour that we produce at WBSU Studios attached to the school that I'm at. But the other one is called Indigenous Politics that I work on alone. And in a few weeks, I hit my 5th year anniversary for that show. And it's called Indigenous Politics from Native New England and Beyond. And in that context, I privilege the area that I reside in because I live on land-grant lands in New England that's often erased as a native space. But the name of the show gives a loose enough rubric where I do include a global scope. And on the Indigenous Politics radio show, I've brought in the issue of occupied Palestine several times over the year, and also did a double episode with 5 different people on the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. And it's interesting to bring the question of Palestine into a Native American, mostly a Native American context, although the show deals with indigenous New Zealand, other parts of the Pacific, as well as South America, but to actually put Palestine in the same frame with Native North American politics is jarring for a lot of people, and that's one of the things that my paper takes up. And related to that, I'll be speaking to the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, which is a new association that was founded in 2008. I'm one of the 6 co-founders, and we've already had scholars bringing their work to the association. The acronym is NISA. One of those scholars is here at the conference, Omar Tesdell, and also Stephen Salaita has brought his research there. And I mentioned both the radio show and NISA as sites that I want to encourage people to think about in terms of articulating your work and presenting in these other fora, in terms of pushing some of these frameworks and how we think about U.S. imperialism. Also, because I'll be speaking on the U.S. and academic boycott of Israel, the acronym is U.S. ACBI, I want to acknowledge the co-founders of the U.S. campaign that are actually in the room. Rabab Abdul Hadi, who's here, is one of the founding members. Majid Shihadi is here, as well as Marcy Newman. And then also Mark Gonzalez, are you here? Mark Gonzalez and Vijay Prashad and I are on the advisory board. I hope I haven't left anybody out, but U.S. ACBI is definitely in the house, in this room and at this conference. The other thing I'll say, this will actually be the first time in my life I've ever presented a caveat before reading a paper. I've never done it before, but I absolutely have to in this case because this paper was written, I finished this paper 2 weeks ago, and it's an 8-page version of something that ended up being like 20 pages as I was writing it. So it's not just a small slice of a work in progress. I sent it to Nancy, who's worked with Alex Lubin's team, before I got on the plane to actually go to Amman, Jordan, a week and a half ago on my way to the West Bank. This is my very first time in the Middle East ever, and I went on a 5-scholar delegation under the auspices of U.S. ACBI, and I've just come from there to this conference. And so this paper was written before that journey, and I didn't bring it with me because Alex and I talked about it, and he said you might not want to have anything about the boycott of Israel when you're actually going through Israeli security. So this paper feels very different to me. I read it this morning. Needless to say, it would be a very different paper had I written it after the journey that I've just been on, which has been so meaningful. And that was also organized by Majid Shihadi as well as Rabab Barakat and Sunayna Myra. I want to acknowledge all the work that they did. I was there with Nikhil Singh, Robin D.G. Kelly, Bill Mullen, and Nefertiti Tadiar, and they looked out for us. And we had an incredibly packed schedule for just several days. And for all of us, I believe for all of us, it was our first time there. No. Native American and Indigenous Studies and the question of boycotting Israel. 2 years ago, at a council meeting of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, NISA, I mentioned to another Indigenous council member and colleague, one who is based in Canada, an email I'd sent to him and 10 other Indigenous scholars a month earlier about U.S. ACBI, for which I serve on the advisory board. I had asked if any of them would consider establishing a Canadian campaign in solidarity with the Palestinian campaign, which was launched in Ramallah in April 2004, and inspired by the struggle of South Africans against apartheid. These campaigns are on response calls from civil society, federations, unions, and organizations to join the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction Movement, BDS, against Israel. The academic and cultural boycott campaign calls for, quote, international civil society organizations and people of conscience all over the world to impose broad boycotts and implement divestment initiatives against Israel until it meets its obligation to recognize the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination and fully complies with the precepts of international law by 1, ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall, 2, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and 3, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. No one had responded to my email at all. So I asked this one colleague why he didn't and why he thought no one else did either. He said he had no interest because in Canada the white leftists take ownership of that issue, as he put it, and he did not think Native scholars would want to be in the minority with them. I asked if the Indigenous scholars might support the initiative if they were presented with the political parallels between Israeli-occupied Palestine and colonial occupations affecting First Nations, Aboriginal, and Métis communities enclosed by Canada. I also pointed out that doing so might prompt white leftists who support the Palestinian cause to support Indigenous struggles at home. Another colleague who publicly supports the boycott interrupted to say that U.S. ACBI or ACBI in general should be supported because it is the right thing to do, not because it could benefit Indigenous struggles at home. I agree, and think though that there's more to say about the parallels and how exploring the historical connections between different forms of settler colonialism and Indigenous removal is a way to build international solidarity for the ACBI, and not just in Canada. In the US, the number of scholars who have endorsed this particular campaign is still low at 592 as of this morning. My presentation here explores the politics of the US ACBI in relation to scholars of Native American studies in particular and Indigenous studies in general, with a focus on the unlawful Israeli occupation of Palestine as an urgent case of genocidal ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is the policy and process of conquering a distant land to send settlers in order to shape its demographic to resemble the metropole. Racism is a central feature of settler societies whose policies push for the destruction of Indigenous societies and then assimilation for those who survive the process of conquest. Patrick Wolf argues that in Indigenous cases, quote, settler colonies are premised on the elimination of Native societies. The split tensing reflects a determinate feature of settler colonization. The colonizers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event, end quote. The politics of indigeneity bring much to bear on critical analyses of Israeli exceptionalism as it is bolstered and bankrolled by American exceptionalism that denies the colonization of Native North America. Comparative examinations of Israeli settler colonialism in relation to questions of occupation, self-determination, and decolonization within the framework of international law demand ethical consideration by Native American and Indigenous studies scholars. And yet I also suggest we move beyond analogical thinking. In her essay, quote, titled, "Queers Are Like Jews, Aren't They? Analogy and Alliance Politics," Janet Jacobson theorizes the risks often attendant to political analogizing. She argues, quote, analogy is the logic of equivalence that can function as a powerful political tool by which struggles can be made recognizable, unquote, and are often effective in making space for new political movements, but that analogical thinking has provided less space for coalitions between movements. Jacobson cautions that, quote, in making likeness or similarity the ground for political coalition or intellectual inquiry, we may inadvertently erase crucial differences, end quote. And instead, she suggests forging connections without foreclosing differences. And here I also want to acknowledge Alex Lubin's recent essay in the special issue of SAQ he co-edited with Alyosha Goldstein on settler colonialism. And that's titled "We Are All Israelis, The Politics of Colonial Comparison," where he takes up Benedict Anderson's book, The Spectre of Comparisons. And in the longer piece, I actually have a section on comparisons, analogies, and what Nikhil Singh is theorizing as linkages. Herein, I explore the grounds for the analogies and how the connection between settler colonialism and what has forged the nation-states of the U.S. and Israel are not merely analogous, they are shaped from many of the same material and symbolic forces. Stephen Salaita argues in his book, The Holy Land in Transit, that the European settlement of the New World came at the expense of the indigenous peoples subjected to ethnic cleansing in ways that informed the European Jewish settlements to found Israel at the expense of the original inhabitants, Palestinians who were living there. And in Israeli exceptionalism, M. Shahid Alam argues that European Zionists determined to create a Jewish state in Palestine induced Western Jews to become colonists and, above all, recruit Western powers to adopt their colonial project. There are numerous possible reasons for why only a small minority of Native American and Indigenous studies scholars have closely watched or publicly supported the Palestinian struggle. Many see the situation as too big and confusing when it's spun as a religious and ethnic conflict that has lasted for thousands of years, people put it. Some who are sympathetic to the Palestinians might resist going public for fear of being accused of anti-Semitism. And some Native American scholars identify with the Jewish efforts to draw parallels between Jewish people and American Indians, especially with regard to the Holocaust and broader questions of genocide. Interestingly, I've heard very few colleagues within Native studies cite academic freedom as a reason for not supporting the academic boycott, a reason often cited by other scholars, but one that is easily countered by those of us within U.S. AFBI who cherish academic freedom and see no conflict between protecting that principle and boycotting institutions that largely support state oppression of Palestinians. Moreover, there is nothing within the AFBI that prohibits or condemns intellectual collaboration with individual academics. It is a boycott of institutions. I'd like to suggest that when further probed, the central barrier, even though not commonly articulated as such, has to do with conflicting and conflicted understandings of indigeneity in the region, especially given that even progressives often still assert that the European Jews who colonized Palestine are ultimately indigenous to it. In his historical work, Shlomo Sand questions whether there was really a forced exile in the first century at the hands of the Romans, and whether it is accurate to regard the Jewish people throughout 2 millennia as both a distinct ethnic group and a nation now returned to its biblical homeland. In his book, The Invention of the Jewish People, he argues that most Jews actually descend from converts whose native lands were scattered far across the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and that the formation of a Jewish people and then a Jewish nation out of these unrelated groups could only take place under the influence of a new historiography developed in response to the rise of European nationalism. Late 19th century European Zionists, determined to create a Jewish state, seized this legacy to forge their own imperialist project. This is arguably a case where race is obscured by claims to ethnicity that overtake indigeneity. In both the US and Israel, white nativist bids for indigeneity rest on the erasure and denial of actual native inhabitants with claims to prior occupancy that is the basis for that sovereignty. The Israeli occupation of Palestine perpetuates colonial apartheid that violently and flagrantly counters the principles of self-determination and human rights. Moreover, it is illegal under international law. Indeed, it is the question of self-determination, with a capital S and a capital D, that is at stake not only in the case of Palestine, but for all indigenous peoples. On the 13th of September 2007, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Because the basic criteria defining colonies under international law include foreign domination and geographical separation from the colonizer, indigenous peoples up until now have been at a disadvantage in terms of the application of decolonization protocols under the UN, an issue heatedly debated throughout the world community because indigenous peoples are often considered subject to internal colonization. This limitation reflects the long-term battle over whether indigenous peoples should be considered peoples with an S at the end, in the context of Chapter 11 of the UN Charter of 1945, which includes the Declaration regarding non-self-governing peoples in Article 73, and within UN General Assembly Resolution 1514, which reads, quote, all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, end quote. Regarding the issue of self-determination, the Declaration itself is ambiguous. On the one hand, Article 3 states, quote, indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, end quote. As you can see, it's just taken directly from the UN statement down the document. But on the other hand, the last article of the Indigenous Declaration, Article 46, states, quote, nothing in this declaration may be construed as authorizing or encouraging any action which would dismember or impair, totally or in part, the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states, end quote. This form of legal discrimination against indigenous peoples has its root in the doctrine of discovery, which of course is rooted in the 1493 Papal Bull, inter cetera, decree issued by Pope Alexander IV to Christopher Columbus by the Roman Catholic Church on his second voyage to the Americas, to establish Christian dominion over the world and the subjugation of non-Christian peoples and seizure of their lands. And I should just have a quick pause here that in the longer piece, I actually am taking the self-determination discussion beyond the indigenous rights framework at the UN, which is not law, right? It's just a declaration, and so people are trying to mobilize around it to get it customary usage. But for me, my point of entry into the Palestinian question actually comes out of the Hawaiian independence movement. And I'm interested in contemporary Hawaiian nationalism that actually is moving away from indigenous rights as a modality for mobilization, and even critical of the UN decolonization protocols. We have a whole independence wing flourishing around the laws of occupation. And so what's always interested me about the question of Palestine is that it shows that none of these are mutually exclusive. And unfortunately, in the Hawaiian context, activists and leaders are actually treating these as totally distinct and unrelated. So those wanting to move under the laws of occupation are actually disavowing that Kanaka Maoli, indigenous Hawaiians like myself, are indigenous people, because they feel it locks us into a politically subordinate category. And yet, indigeneity is a politically subordinate category internationally, but there's more to it than that, right? There's the indigenous substance in terms of cultural norms, and also they only see decolonization within a narrow legal framework and not sort of in a broader context. So they'll say, for example, we don't need to go through the UN decolonization protocols because Hawaii shouldn't have been reported to the list of non-self-governing territories after World War II in the first place because we were already an independent state. We'd already achieved self-determination. So there's all these divisions, and so I'm actually putting this into conversation with struggles over nationhood and international law in the Palestinian context. Talk about the paradox of sovereignty, actually, and what independence even means, and the problems with international law in the 21st century. Now, I'm just going to shift back, though, to the American Indian Palestinian parallel here. The historical and political parallels between the U.S. and Israel are especially striking when comparing the enduring ideology of Christian manifest destiny with Jewish Zionism. In his essay, Canaanites, Cowboys, and Indians Reconsidered, Robert Warrior connects Palestine and its peoples to the broader indigenous world and its peoples based on a study of Jewish and Christian scripture. He critiques Christian liberation theologies that ground themselves in narratives of indigenous expropriation and Jewish or Christian exceptionalism. He asks, quote, what does the presence of the indigenous groups of what is now Palestine say about the narratives of conquest in the Hebrew Bible and Christian scriptures? How does an indigenous reading of these narratives inform an understanding that not just of the place of indigenous tribal peoples in those scriptural traditions, but also in the history of Western traditions that have drawn theological and narrative inspiration, not to mention political and cultural justification from these scriptures, end quote. In getting at the nexus of North American and Israeli settler colonialism, Warrior points out that these are the same narratives of conquest that give rise to ideological justification of genocidal settlement. As legal scholar Stephen Newcomb argues in his book Pagans in the Promised Land, U.S. federal Indian law and policy are premised on Old Testament narratives of the chosen people and the promised land. This belief is exemplified in the 1823 Supreme Court ruling Johnson v. McIntosh that the first Christian people to discover lands inhabited by natives deemed heathens have an ultimate title to dominion over the lands and peoples. This statecraft is supported by the ideology of Zionism in claiming the Holy Land as the rightful place for the existence of a sovereign Jewish state. And I'm just wrapping up one last paragraph. Salaita argues that, quote, Israel's sense of exceptionalism is quite similar to the one in the United States. They don't use the term manifest destiny, but the concept is very much at play, the idea that they are affecting modernity. In Palestine, the same way the United States did. In other words, they're taking pre-civilized societies and they're removing them and clearing a space for civilization. Or they're undergoing a process of civilizing them and bringing them into modernity, end quote. I'm just wrapping up here. Edward Said delineates the links between Zionism and European imperialism and colonialism. Quote, for whatever it may have done for Jews, Zionism essentially saw Palestine as the European imperialists did, as an empty territory paradoxically filled with ignoble or perhaps even dispensable natives, and did not think except in negative terms of the natives, who were passively supposed to accept the plans made for their land, even in light of native resistance. And it is Said's commitment to resistance during his lifetime that leads me back to the U.S. campaign for the academic and cultural boycott as part of the broader BDS movement as I conclude this presentation. It is a very effective and ethical element of popular resistance against Israel's illegal military occupation and apartheid system. What I learned as a Kanaka Maoli scholar from studying how settler colonialisms work in Israeli-occupied Palestine brings me back to both support for the boycott being the right thing to do, and also one that Native scholars outside Palestine should not view with indifference, but as a way to deepen knowledge and solidarity necessary to fight settler colonialism on its many and interconnected fronts. Thank you.
Can you get the air conditioning turned off, please? Or hasn't?
Yeah.
Air conditioning?
It's cold.
It's on again?
Sorry. Can I just speak from here?
Yeah.
I'm Malini Jones-Schuler. I'm a professor of English at the University of Florida, and my field is broadly U.S. Empire Studies. And I'm proud to say it's actually, I think I can say it's a field, and I'm happy to say wasn't a field 20 years ago. Anyway, in the December issue of US ACT, the editors noted, quote, there's a great need to build the academic boycott movement, arguably more difficult given campaigns of censorship and silencing of the Palestine question in the US Academy. In my talk today, I want to address this silencing. Can you hear me? Yeah. I want to address the silencing through three contexts in order to address the larger problem of the US academic left in relation to the BDS movement. The first context is scholarship on the university by left critics. The second is the AAUP's conception of academic freedom and the common good. And the third is the Occupy movement, particularly the student wing of the Occupy movement. And what I'm going to suggest that despite all the apparent differences in these three contexts, all three are sort of hamstrung by the idea of the US university as somehow unrelated to questions of imperialism and colonialism. So first, the scholarship on the university. And as a case, I'm just going to deal with a book by Christopher Newfield called Unmaking the Public University, which really is a very rigorous kind of analysis of why universities have engaged the ire and the energies of the right since the 1970s. Christopher Newfield argues that the massive increase in public spending post-World War II, of which public universities were beneficiaries, was propelled by widespread social activism and various civil rights movements that sought universal access to its ideals of social development. The result was a public university where different classes and races could unite to challenge the traditional elite. Civil rights was central to the idea of mass entitlement for higher education. The culture wars which emerged just when the universities were being democratized were also economic wars which sought to reduce the economic claims of the subversive mass by discrediting the cultural framework that had been empowering it. That's the argument. The post-9/11 right attacks on universities, Newfield argues, are attacks on a competing vision of a multilateral civic world that couldn't be ruled by dominant political or economic interests. And I think Newfield's analysis of the public university is very powerful because it links the cultural and economic in very compelling ways. But I'd like to extend this linkage in ways that Newfield doesn't. Newfield and a number of scholars who provided excellent critiques of the corporatization of contemporary higher education, and I'm thinking here of Derek Bok, Mark Busquet, Sheila Slaughter, Jennifer Washburn. They see the US university in purely national terms, which is kind of surprising given all the talk about globalization. Scholars focusing on transnational aspects of US universities did so in the context of the Cold War, and notably it was Ellen Schrecker in No Ivory Tower, McCarthyism and the Universities, published in 1986. Other books focusing on academia's role in the Cold War have emerged since then. More recently, Andrew Ross has focused on the rush to establish satellite campuses overseas and critique the impetus to provide substandard education via cheaper labor abroad. However, apart from studies specific to the Cold War, there is no systematic analysis of the US universities linked to imperialism. And I want to say, just like Spivak said in 1985 in relation to 19th century British literature, it should not be possible to analyze a 21st century US university without a consideration of imperialism. US universities have been central players in the technologies of imperialism, beginning with the administration of, possibly even earlier, administration of the Philippines as a colony in 1898, in which professors provided anthropological, cultural, and pedagogical insights. But they've also been, universities have also been sites of dissent. So I suggest that the competing egalitarian vision offered by the university, to which Newfield argues the right responded, was enabled not simply by civil rights, but also by a commitment to decolonization. Students in the Third World Movement in California showed solidarity with national liberation movements, as did the Black Panthers. The democratization of the university through civil rights and the 1965 Immigration Act created a space for anti-imperial politics. Student activists attacked the complicity of academics with initiatives like Project Camelot. Thus, the culture wars of the right sought to curb not only the economic demands of a potential coalition of the dispossessed, but also the threat of those who challenge the United States' imperial interests abroad. So I think there's a problem with left analysis like Newfield that reduces anti-affirmative action imperatives to economic threats alone. Because these purely economic analyses don't explain domestic racism or colonialism. And if, as Newfield suggests, the university is a site of radical democracy, we need to recognize that this democracy was enabled in part by movements for decolonization, and that such movements can be central and energizing to the university today. Identifying and resisting the nodes of US imperial power, including that of Palestinian occupation, would be part of the democratization of the university. My next thing, the context is the AAUP and its arguments about academic freedom and the common good. So here's a quote from the AAUP. We reject proposals that curtail the freedom of teachers and researchers to engage in work with academic colleagues, and we reaffirm the paramount importance of the freest possible international movement of scholars and ideas. The AAUP urges the AUT to support the right of all in the academic community to communicate freely with other academics on matters of professional interest, unquote. The statement was made by the AAUP in 2005 in response to the AUT Congress's call for a boycott of two Israeli universities, Haifa and Bar Ilan. The AAUP referred to its 1940 document, which states that universities are, quote, conducted for the common good, unquote, and that the common good depends upon the free search for truth and its free exposition, for which academic freedom is essential. The AAUP recognized the right of non-cooperation by individual faculty, but opposed a systematic academic boycott, which threatens what they call the principles of free expression. Reflecting on its position in relation to South Africa, the AAUP distinguished between economic boycotts which bring pressure on a regime and academic boycotts which affect individuals and academic freedom. But of course, if universities are conducted for the common good, the academic boycott of Israeli universities seems all but obvious. The common good of, say, the Islamic University of Gaza can't be served by bombing it, for instance. The question is the limited conception of the universal, or a fantasy of the available universal by the AAUP. For whose common good are universities conducted? Whose common good actually matters? Here again, the importance of civil rights, anti-war and third world movements on US college campuses, articulated as movements for the common good, cannot be underestimated. The AAUP argument that academic freedom involves the free exchange of ideas and therefore freedom to move across national boundaries involve luxuries unavailable to many Palestinian academics who sometimes cannot travel to their own institutions, let alone get visas to travel internationally. The academic freedom defended by the AAUP is thus a geopolitically based privilege rather than a trans-historical right. And Judith Butler has argued for, quote, a more robust conception of academic freedom that considers the material and institutional foreclosures that make it impossible for certain historic subjects to lay claim to the discourse of rights itself, unquote. But it is precisely a liberal notion of freedom that the AAUP and other critics of the academic boycott endorse when they accede to divestment calls because they target businesses located in settlement areas, but don't support an academic boycott because it undermines this liberal idea of freedom. So academic freedom needs to be seen in the context not of the liberal idea of freedom, but of education strategically seen as a human right. And this is something that the founding members of AFI have affirmed, this sort of context-based view of academic freedom. In their 2006 report on boycotts, the AAUP stated, quote, in protesting against apartheid in South Africa, the AAUP carefully distinguished between economic and academic boycotts, largely on matters of principle. Economic boycotts seek to bring pressure to bear on the regime responsible for violations of rights. They are not meant to impair the ability of scholars to write, teach, and pursue research, although they may have that results. Academic boycotts, in contrast, strike directly at the free exchange of ideas, even as they are aimed at the university administrations, or in the case of AUT, call for a boycott of Israeli universities, political parties in power, unquote. But this separation of the academic from the economic and political, particularly in the service of empire, is highly questionable. Currently, the US Army's human terrain systems operative in Afghanistan and Iraq, which places economists, historians, and sociologists, for instance, places the expertise and experience of social scientists and regional experts, coupled with reach back, open source research, directly in support of deployed units engaging in full spectrum operations, unquote. Project Minerva has received the blessing of major anthropologists. Martha Nussbaum, who has opposed the boycott on tactical and moral grounds, argues that scholars with strong views about Israeli government ought to focus on public protests directed at the government and not in academics. And of course, this doesn't recognize the academics that are directly involved in the support of government and many that are indirectly associated. That defenses of academic freedom are highly political has been evident in the furor that's been generated over the idea that Israeli academics can be boycotted. When Britain's Universities and College Union mandated the circulation of the full text of the Palestinian boycott to all UCU branches for purposes of discussion, 300 US university presidents signed a full-page ad in the New York Times titled, "Boycott Israeli Universities, Boycott Ours Too." Not one of these presidents protested Israel's bombardment of the Islamic University of Gaza in 2008. When the MLA Delegate Assembly in 2008, in recognition of the persecution faced by scholars teaching about Israeli occupation, passed a resolution expressing solidarity with scholars of Palestinian culture, Kerry Nelson proposed instead a resolution expressing solidarity with scholars of both Israeli and Palestinian culture. And at a recent conference, when I asked Kerry Nelson why the AAUP was against the boycott publicly, he sidestepped the issue and cited the AAUP's condemnation of the campaign against Finkelstein instead. And my third context is the Occupy movement, connections and solidarities. So if we want to claim the campus as a site for radical democracy, we need a broader, more activist version of academic freedom. If, like left critics such as Newfield, we want to see the university as championing a multilateral civic world, this world can't be restricted to national borders. Nothing has made this clearer more recently than the Occupy Wall Street movement, which has as a major constituency students who have been agitating for debt forgiveness. Anya Kamenetz of the Huffington Post suggests that the student loan debt has become a defining issue of the Occupy Wall Street movement, unquote. Articulating the clearly evident solidarity with activism in the Middle East, the fact that the leaders of these popular latter revolts have themselves been inspired by the Palestinian struggle has been largely ignored by the academic left. Others in the Occupy movement at large have criticized BDS supporters for mixing up causes and suggest that the movement is being co-opted by anti-Semites. Mapping the convergence between the Occupy movement and Palestine has been the purview only of groups specifically interested in Palestine. These groups have appeared with posters such as Occupy Wall Street, Not Palestine, Take Back Your $3 billion that fund Israeli apartheid, thus creatively urging people to think about their own participation in the occupation. Some of these groups are Students for Justice in Palestine, which have been actively involved in the BDS movement, the Jewish 99%, and Adala New York, the New York campaign for the boycott of Israel. Adala New York read a statement of solidarity issued by Palestine's BDS National Committee advocating boycotts at Zuccotti Park, which read in part, quote, "Palestinians too are part of the 99% around the world that suffer at the hands of the 1%. Corporate power has not just profited from our suffering, but has colluded in maintaining Israel's occupation and apartheid to perpetuate an unjust order that profits oil and military companies and multinational financial institutions." Unquote. It takes no genius to figure out that corporate interests in the US universities and Israeli colonialism often converge. Let me give just one example. The widespread use of militarized security firms like Margolis and Healy, which is one of the foremost firms, by US campuses reflects a national trend, particularly since 9/11, to constantly prepare tactics for dealing with the threat of unpredictable violence or terror. The consequences of having heightened apparatuses of security on the national level have been well documented: racial profiling and unwarranted detentions. But these apparatuses of security don't function in isolation from those designed to meet the threat of terror abroad. For instance, Margolis and Healy tout as their credentials the fact that their senior partner, Dr. Gary Margolis, former chief of police at the University of Vermont, traveled to Israel in 2008, quote, as an invited guest of the Israeli government to study terrorism and share his expertise with the Israel National Police and Israel Defense Forces, unquote. In other words, university students in the US, like Palestinians, are viewed as threats to be subdued. And of course, this has struck home recently with the suppression of students at UC Davis and other campuses since November 2011. Just as groups like SGS, Students for Justice in Palestine, are challenging the Occupy movement to think of occupied Palestine and divest, progressive scholars and left critics of academia need to find creative ways in which to think about their own universities in relation to those of their colleagues in Palestine. This isn't to deny the power of a program like the Student Debt Campaign, which derives much of its momentum from its domestic scalar form, but only to suggest that the energies of such a program can also be effectively harnessed to protest not only the indenture of students to banks in the US, but also the investments of these very banks in Israel, thus furthering mechanisms for keeping students under occupation. Ultimately, the BDS movement in general and the academic and cultural boycott in particular will have force in the US Academy only when discourses on the university in general don't treat Palestine as an exception to the university at large, but consider universities under occupation as central to questions about universities in general. I'm thinking, for instance, of the anthology Toward a Global Autonomous University, published by the EduFactory Collective in 2009, which deals with the idea of the university as a commons and as a site of neoliberal restructuring, and which posits the idea of an autonomous global university with a new order of unrestricted knowledge. Yet this global collection, so focused on the rights to the knowledge commons, simply ignores Palestinian universities under occupation. In wake of Israel's attack on the Gaza Freedom Flotilla in May 2010, Omar Barghouti wrote in relation to the numerous groups boycotting Israel that the South African moment has arrived for Palestine. Perhaps it has, but not yet in US academia, where the right views a boycott as a legitimizing of terror, and most of the left chooses either to ignore Palestine or support normalization. Thank you.
I was planning early before I came to the conference to read that paper, but today I decided to change that, and I have made an outline for a brief kind of like discussion, and I realized that most of my points, or some of them at least, were discussed by El-Amine and El-Amine. So I will make my part quite short. I will discuss 2 points mainly, or 2 aspects. One, the campaign for the boycott in the US and the issues around that. And 2, the campaign in Palestine and some of the difficulties that make it much more widespread. When the campaign started in the US, several arguments were raised as a way to block it or to make it complicate the issue of the boycott of Israel academically and culturally. One of the things that Melanie and Giovanni talked about is the question of academic freedom and how the boycott could be used or could be argued against as something that limits the academic freedom of American scholars on one hand, but also of Israeli scholars on the other hand. Of course, as it was mentioned, neglecting the academic freedom of Palestinians, who, for example, colleagues at my university in Beirut, who wait all the time to the last day to know whether they are going to leave the country or not, based on a permit to travel that Israel controls. So one of my colleagues oftentimes buys the tickets, preparing himself for the conference, and the last day that he will know whether he is leaving or not, and oftentimes also loses the money that he pays for the ticket because Israel refuses to give him the permit to leave the country. Another argument also was used within this kind of like as a tactic, whether this tactic is harmful in a sense in the context of Israeli politics, meaning that whether the tactic of boycott could harm the position of the left in Israel, and whether that would give more room for the right wing in Israel, maybe even turn some people who are in between to become unsupportive of the resolution of the Palestinian question. Again, ignoring some of the points were mentioned that the boycott is not really against individuals, but basically against institutions, and specifically against projects that promote Israel as a normalized Israel. In addition to the left in Israel, the argument was that there is a Palestinian community in Israel that the boycott might prevent Americans who are really supportive of the Palestinian question, of the Palestinian cause, and prevent them from collaborating with Palestinian scholars and who are citizens of the state of Israel. Again, which is similar to this one, working with Palestinian scholars in 48 does not negate the core concept of the boycott. The idea, some people also tried to argue early on when we tried to initiate the campaign that instead of boycotting, meaning doing something against, why don't we do something for? Meaning, why don't we do something for Palestinians instead of boycotting Israeli academia and boycotting Israel culturally? As if one cannot do both at the same time, meaning that we can boycott Israel academically and culturally, at the same time doing work with Palestinian scholars, collaborative work, as well as all kinds of support. And when we met the president of BUSAID with Kevolani and the other members of the delegation, he talked about several ways that Israel blocks the Palestinian Academy from developing. One of them is blocking, for example, labs and equipment for labs in different subjects in science, physics, chemistry, and engineering, as well as limiting the way that BUSAID tries to develop its faculty. One of the difficulties that BUSAID has in bringing in faculty from outside is how Israel doesn't allow internationals or those who don't have Palestinian ID from being in the West Bank for more than 3 months. So anyone who is hired from outside has to leave the country every 3 months somewhere and then come back to renew the visa. All these questions were part of the issues that we faced when we initiated the campaign for the boycott. Of course, there were other difficulties, I think, in that context. One of them, in my view, was the weakness of the Arab faculty in the US Academy. And that weakness, meaning taking a position, and I'm not talking about everyone. I'm talking there was, for example, a quite well-known and established Arab scholars who either didn't take a position or opposed the campaign for similar reasons, and I don't want to talk for long about that. That is in contrast to very powerful and strong position by Jewish American academics who opposed the boycott. So we have on one hand either silence by Arab academics, especially established ones, and on the other hand, quite very strong voice by Jewish academics in the US who opposed and tried to block the campaign for the boycott. Of course, this is in a context of depoliticized academy, an academy in the US, like everywhere else, that is focused on careers. So everyone is interested only on improving his or her position within the academic career, which oftentimes is seen as taking such a position, a political position, as this one might be harmed due to not being received positively by those who are quite powerful in the academy. Specifically, I will emphasize that, and I'm willing to discuss it later on, especially the fear of retaliation by powerful administrators who are sympathetic to Israel, but also powerful Jewish faculty in the US. And also in the context of the racist anti-Arab culture in the US that makes the position or the situation of the Arabs in the US much more difficult. Culture that's quite sympathetic to Israeli settler colonialism that makes sympathy with Israel much more easier than with the Palestinian natives of the country. One of the questions, and I think like was at the end of all these kind of discussions, was the fear by many faculty, those who even say we support the Palestinian cause, and those who even say that we are anti-Zionist, is the question of delegitimating Israel. The campaign for Boycott was seen, and still being seen, as a tactic to delegitimate Israel, which I think is at the core of exceptionalizing Israel, a state that is by nature a settler colonial one, a racist state that needs to be normalized according to this exceptional framework, according to all kinds of myths that you talked about, Giovanni. On the other side, in Palestine, one difficulty that we face, and I think often mentioned, is the question of the tactic that's used in the boycott, specifically around the very detailed, almost like fatwa giving what is allowed and what's not. Meaning, for example, there are all kinds of details and discussions around can one come to support the Palestinians, and are we allowed to work with someone who is supportive of Palestinians if he comes crosses through the Jordan border or through the Israeli airport? Is it okay if someone goes to Israel first and then comes to Palestine, to the Palestinian territories later? All kinds of complicated and detailed kind of rules that makes people sometimes have difficulty taking the position of the boycott without reservations. And this is, in my view, due this tactic or so much focus on these kind of detailed rules is, in my view, is due to the lack of larger intellectual conceptualization of boycott, which I think, in my view, should be based on principles or aspects or ideas of denormalization and decolonization. Denormalization meaning that we need to work on denormalizing our defeat and inferiority, not only vis-a-vis Israel, but also vis-a-vis the West, including knowledge, which is actually, so far, we have not done. Two, and the idea of decolonization must be within this concept, framed around intellectual decolonization first, that also requires, or it will lead to, or is in my view, the first step towards decolonizing economically and politically. And one important factor that I think makes the Palestinian case a bit weak, at least in the last 20, 30 years, is the disconnecting of the Palestine question from other cases and other causes that I think quite harmful to the Palestinian cause. And I think in this sense, over time, I think the Palestinians have mirrored the Israeli exceptionalism with a Palestinian exceptionalism that one is makes us weak, thinking that the Israeli case of settler colonialism is so special, so exceptional, that sometimes makes us not take a much stronger stand and be much more active in our decolonization, and also makes us misunderstand our case itself. Meaning that if we connect our case, for example, to the American case of settler colonialism, one, we will understand our case better. Two, we'll find better allies and we'll be much more honest to ourselves, and we'll be able to move forward in a much more kind of broader sense, and not to be focused too much on the nitty, small details of where the problem occurs and where the problem sits. And this is my last point.
Great, so we have a lot of time for questions, discussion, And I'm also going to have someone send around the sign-up sheet, so hopefully some of you who haven't endorsed will consider endorsing. And I also want to say we do take names of people who are outside the U.S., so if you don't teach in the United States, you're also welcome to sign up. Alex?
Yeah, Marcy's taking names and kicking. Thank you for the panel. It was very, very interesting. Kehlani, I have a question for you based on something that happened at the University of New Mexico and in the state of New Mexico last year. The Jewish Federation of New Mexico, which is tied into large national Zionist organizations, funded a cultural diplomacy project of Israeli archaeologists to talk about indigeneity on Native American reservations, nations, pueblos in New Mexico. And the title of the cultural diplomacy was focused around indigenous rights, the rights of Jewish indigenous people to the land of Israel, as well as, presumably, and I don't know, the rights of indigenous people in the Southwest. And as you know from being in the West Bank, many of the projects of Israeli colonialism involve archaeological projects to uncover presumably indigenous Jewish roots in the land, right? So what I'm wondering is how productive is indigeneity as a radical form of comparison, and to what extent might it be limited by the Israeli project of claiming indigeneity?
Why don't you just get right to the heart of the matter, Alex? The productivity of indigeneity and the limits of indigeneity. I mean, your example is a really incredibly rich one. I was telling Alex when we had a coffee before the conference started a couple days ago that in this piece that I quote Robert Warrior talking about his own relationship through studying theology, also being a student of Edward Said. He also traces a third note in terms of what turned him around, and he had volunteered into archaeological volunteer programs sponsored by the Israeli government, you know, a long time ago, and he was actually at a site where people were trying to find this sort of indigenous Jewish threads in terms of pottery and whatnot, and he, on the second trip, they actually found themselves unbeknownst to them, at a burial site, an Arab burial site, where they actually, somebody had exhumed human remains. And this, Robert Warrior is a Native American scholar, he's from Osage tribal nation, and this changed everything. He's never come back, and he was actually, he would have been on this delegation, but was unable to make it. But I just mention that because archaeology is such a central piece of contestation over indigeneity all over the place. We can see that all throughout North America as well, right? With Kennewick Man and the sort of the race for origins, the race to try and find that originality that is about indigeneity. And that's one of the quickest ways that people actually try and dismiss people's indigenous claims. In the Pacific Islands, it's always about where did you really come from and how long have you been there? As though that's just a given, but these are different epistemological frameworks, right? I mean, even within ethnohistorical and archaeological camps, the jury's out. There's no consensus even among them, but that's a very different kind of epistemological framework than saying that you're actually born of the land through Papahana, Moku, and Wakea, and that, you know, the Kalo, the Taro is actually your elder sibling. It's just an incredibly different kind of framework in terms of reckoning human origins and how we understand ourselves in relation to other living entities, other beings, and ancestral beings as well as deities. And so to me it's a trap. In terms of being an indigenous person, I don't step into that because it's always about discounting, because ultimately at the end of that logic is everyone's really an immigrant anyway. And that's really how it's used in the United States, right, to dismiss American Indian claims. It's really about dispossessing. It's about bolstering state efforts to dispossess people of their lands. And you can see that with the with the claims for the people at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, right? There was a huge New York Times expose on that. I mean, this just goes on. So I mean, I think that though the productivity of it, I mean, those are the limits, and it's high risk, right? And the stakes are so high. But I think that in terms of the productivity, what Majid ended his presentation on in terms of linking up to actually be able to understand the power of settler colonialisms in different sites and understand different articulations of indigeneity, I think is incredibly powerful. And I think that for me, that's at the core of solidarity work. And that also happens to be my own point of entry, but I actually think it's powerful in a lot of ways. And that is not because I'm privileging indigeneity as an identity category. What for me it is about radical relationality. Because for me, that's what indigeneity is. It's about relationality. It's always in relation to land, and it's in relation to other people. And within indigenous frameworks, there actually is room for everybody, unlike in the Western systems and in some Eastern systems. There actually is room for everybody. There's a place for everybody in that system. And I think that for me, that's where my anarchist sensibilities come into play, because that's outside of state-driven contexts. And that's about us kind of decolonizing in a cultural sense. We have to figure out a different way to relate to each other and a different way of living in this world together.
First of all, thank you for an excellent panel. I wanted to address some of the points that you mentioned that the numbers are really low, like over 500. But I think, I mean, maybe this is the numbers of the people who signed on the US were actually, but if you look at all the campaigns historically from the Colombia one, there is a whole bunch of them that you actually count. There are a lot of people who've been involved. And I think we may actually need to think about the quantitative rule differently, the game, and see who are the people who are out there. So that's kind of that one thing. The second point is, I'm just wondering about, we need some kind of like analysis, good analysis, and confrontation of the whole question about identity politics. And it sort of follows what Alex is doing. And now, for instance, African American churches. And I'm not talking about kind of like, we know the Zionists and the liberal left and so on, we talked about that. But I'm talking about the people who have historically been allies and working together and so on, communities of color. So now there is this new trend, which has been going on for quite a while, but it's relatively new, about touring Ethiopian Israeli groups all over and talking about identity politics as skin color. So I think we need to kind of, I mean, there are specific things that we really need to kind of like have more analysis, more writing, more ways to kind of say this is really problematic and so on, and talk about the questions of justice at the center of it. I also think that one of the problems that we have is the position of the Palestinian Authority. I mean, this is very different from South Africa. In South Africa, only the Bantustans used to support the South African regimes. With our case, I mean, yes, it is a kind of Bantu, but it is the official Palestinian Authority that says boycott only settlements, but everything else outside of the settlements is fine. And so this Fayyadism and so on. So I think that kind of like really makes it very complicated, and we need to kind of figure out, because we can't just kind of like not talk about it because it's there. And when a president of a major Palestinian university goes to the UK to undermine British boycott efforts, I mean, that's really problematic. So we really need to kind of like, come out with it and not dismiss it. And in this sense, the kind of like my last one was about the Arab. I mean, there has been historically a very strong Arab tradition of boycott. Lebanon is one of it. If you have a stand on the side, you can come in. But I think we need to kind of like do more of that, because since the PA, there has been a lot of people coming, saying, oh, it's okay, well, we need to connect with the Palestinians, so let's get Arab artists and Arab writers and Arab. And I think we need to kind of like think about that. Maybe I think we need spaces besides just panels and so on to come together and really brainstorm about kind of like, okay, how do we push it through?
Can I just add just one thing, because I don't want to misrepresent in terms of the quantifications. When I cited 592, I said scholars. I actually didn't count the number for those that identify as artists and cultural workers, and that number as of this morning was 199. and then the international colleagues, and that's why Marcy said you too can endorse as an international colleague. It's just that it's identifiable in a separate category on the site. It's numbered at 87. So I think that for me the issue of the numbers, because I brought up the stat with a colleague at Beirut University, she said, well, that's actually a lot. And I thought, yeah, except I'm the only faculty member on my campus and I can't get anyone to join me. And so in that moment, it feels very, very, very slim. I mean, the curator of our art gallery signed on under Wesleyan University, and she's no longer at the school. So I mean, and we have incredibly high-profile people on this list, right? I mean, Ella Shohat has endorsed this, Judith Butler's endorsed this, Gayatri Spivak has endorsed this. I mean, we have really incredible, incredibly high-profile people, but I think for me, the reason that I still go back to the numbers isn't just to reduce it to that, but it's about a climate shift that I think that we really need to counter consciousness so that we reach a critical mass so that there's not stigma attached to signing on to this, because there is so much risk involved in terms of people's reputation because of the specter of anti-Semitism that is still so incredibly powerful in U.S. academia.
Thank you all for your presentations. I have three brief questions. To what extent does the normalization of relations between Arab countries and Israel weaken, undermine, or affect the boycott movement and really in non-Arab spaces? Second question is related to the boycott movement in Britain. It seems to me that in Britain, the movement is much more successful. Is it because of the judicial system that is more favorable, or is it because of the pro-Israeli lobbies are not as sophisticated as they are in the US, or not? For you can enlighten us on that. And the third question is addressed specifically to Majid. To what extent can the wave of uprisings that swept the Arab world in recent months, to what extent can that reinvigorate the decolonization bid of the Palestinians?
I think definitely, especially after Oslo, Israel used that as a way to normalize itself in different places, not just in the US and in Europe, but also in Asia and Africa. And that actually definitely makes it, I mean, the normalization not only of the Arab, but also the Palestinian leadership of Israel, makes it difficult to wage a campaign against Israel around the issue of boycott. This is definitely so. I think connecting that to the second question, because you wanted to see if that is specifically affecting the US context. The second part, you talked about Europe, and if you look at the differences between Europe, European campaigns, and the American ones, you would see a huge difference in the way it's talked about, how many people support it, how many different unions, and openly so are boycotting Israel. So definitely there is one, probably more public space open to the kind of the question of Palestine in Europe, but I think definitely so that the Jewish lobby in the US is much more stronger. They try actually, for example in Britain, they try to change the laws so that we don't go after Israeli officials. They manage, they still have some power in different places, but not as powerful as the case in the US, where you have, like you mentioned, 300 presidents of universities immediately respond to the boycott call by taking sides with Israel. If you boycott Israel, you should boycott us. That will not happen. We didn't see that in Britain, for example, in the campaign, or other European countries. Quite the opposite. The Arab Spring, I think, it depends. I think there is definitely a shift in the environment. We can see that in Egypt, where we, for the first time, clear hostility and rejection of Israel came to the scene after the revolution. But that's not enough. I think there is a need to also for the Palestinian community to connect with the Arab revolutions, and much more kind of like not only honest way, but also like a much more equal way. So we shouldn't focus only on the Palestine question and these revolutions, but connect with the Arab people and their own revolutions, because in the end, the people in the region will not leave the Palestinians alone. Want to, even to their interests, that relationship with Israel is quite harmful. So in the long run, I think people power in the Arab countries will lead to marginalization of Israel. Relationship between Egypt and Israel is one example where, if you look at the economic, military, and so on, and political one, you could see that the relationship is harmful to Egypt due to that peace treaty and so on. Economically, the gas that Egypt sells to Israel, it's quite cheaper than any price that Israel could get from anywhere. So even economically, it will be helpful for Egypt to disconnect itself from Israel, which will help in the end to change the position of at least the balance of power with Israel. But that will take time to see how things will change in the region around Syria, Jordan, because these are the countries that are around Israel. How the situation in Syria will affect Lebanon, but definitely it won't be as good as it has been for Israel so far.
It seems to be the shock waves that once reached Palestine from Israel. There were uprisings, there were demonstrations in Israel. It came from the Israelis, not from the Palestinians. There was social grievances.
Exactly, but the demonstrations in Israel are much more focused on economic issues. And actually they are also manipulated. There are quite interesting writings about it. Maybe we'll talk about it. Unrelated to the Palestine question, these demonstrations, unrelated to Israeli policies in the West Bank, or unrelated to Israeli policies in 48, unrelated to the racist structure of the state. They are not really upset about how racist the state itself. They are just upset about how much the state is not giving them even more. I mean, if you go to Israel, you will see how much privileges that society has. Even though it's taken aid from the U.S., it has a quite very high standard of living. Free medical care, and I'm talking about like really free, not any condition. One is treated without charge. Things that make many people in the US go bankrupt. If you have like cancer or some very expensive treatment in the US, you cannot really afford it. In Israel, it's provided free by the state. If you look at the infrastructure of schools, roads, everything. So still, that's not enough for them, because there is also the militarized state uses some of that money that's coming from outside to do projects that could some people, and that's part of the movement. Israel campaign, it's used in projects that they feel it could have that were not needed. For example, expansion of settlements. For them, it's too much, not because it's bad for the Palestinians, because it's like that money could be better in their pockets. They want more money to have at hand.
Yeah, but my point is that they use
the Arab revolution.
To serve that one agenda.
Yeah. Now the Palestinian social
everybody expected a lot of Palestinians to
use
it was to
definitely, I mean, definitely there is. But also the situation in Palestine is quite complicated with the Palestinian Authority. One, two, it's a society that's exhausted, many revolts and many deaths and many suffering that really didn't lead anywhere. But the opposite. It led to worse conditions. So there is some kind of also. There is some movement on the ground that's trying to respond to the Arab Revolution, but it's still limited. And it's limited for all kinds of reasons. One, the internal divisions exist, the Palestinian Authority, and also the Israeli occupation changed its nature. So in Palestinian towns and cities, you don't see the soldiers. There's no one to like in the first Intifada, there were people in the street, Israeli soldiers in the street that you could go and fight against them or demonstrate against them. Now they don't, they're not around. They're outside. And that makes the situation a bit complicated. But there is some change. I think even the Palestinian Authority, if you follow the news and the discussions in the last few weeks, where there is a shift even in Fatah, because it became so apparent that if they stick to the kind of line that they are doing with Israel, with these endless negotiations, the state will swallow them. And especially there is a fear also that Hamas will take over if Fatah doesn't do anything different. And there is a talk about ending the negotiations. There is a talk about popular resistance, an organized one. There is a talk about also helping the boycott. So there is now, for example, which is different than what, or a change to what Rabab was talking about, which was true before. Now, at the university, we are getting some news that that the Palestinian Authority is going to be paying attention much more to those who work with Israel, because we have also Palestinian faculty who work with Israeli institutions, and they're also under critique and so on. Now, the Palestinian Authority itself, at least 2-3 ministers that I heard from are critical of that, and actually they're initiating, putting some pressure to change that situation. So we'll see what happens. But the Palestinian situation is quite weak, I think, for much more to the issues that I talked about. How we connect our struggle, how we enlarge the concept of boycott to connect with other causes, how we think about boycott is much more important than the Palestinian Authority, because the Palestinian Authority, even its condition, it's related to our own. I mean, the Palestinian Authority didn't come from the air from the start. It's part of our society. And it came because of our weakness, not because of our strength. Didn't come, I mean, now there are differences. There are people who support it, there are people who oppose it. I oppose it myself. But there are a lot of people who support it because the structure on the ground created invested interest between certain, that peace process that was taking place for a long time, and people lively. We're talking about the hundreds of thousands of people who are connected to that process through salaries. And we'll see what happens.
Bassem? Yeah, actually the example that Alex gave illustrates to me two things, and also I would like to suggest also some of the references that you made in your talk with mentioning Shlomo Sand and so forth. I ask a question, in my book, who is native? Who is native in terms of our situation, the Palestinian situation? And I think the example that Alex gave illustrates the deceptiveness and the insidiousness of the Zionist system, which tries to portray the entitlement to Palestine as a native entitlement. But otherwise, there would be somebody who says, okay, the Jews have been there 3,000 years, 4,000. That's a myth. We have to reply to it, but we have to reply to it with evidence and with careful research.
I mean, two things. One I want to talk about is the question of Jews or not Jews, and the other one is like this kind of like, if they claim native, we should claim native. I think sometimes there is a risk of like being reactionary in the way we go about challenging the system in Palestine. I don't think we should spend too much time on evidencing who was first and who was second and all of that. I think there is a room to critique the settler colonial structure away from being obsessed with origins and blood and all of that. That's one. Two, I use Jews not because of not by accident.
I wasn't critical of you,
not by accident, but it's on purpose, because You know, and when you say Israel, like Israelis, you know, there are many Palestinians who are Israelis, you know, who are citizens.
We're talking about Israelites. That's a big confusion. Israelite versus Israelis.
Oh,
you know, right?
okay.
That's a big confusion.
Then I could, okay. That's enough. But just, I think it's important to not to be obsessed, basically, with in a reactionary way with arguments that Zionists use, and Israel uses, and the Jews who support Israel use. Their prayers and all of
Firm Palestinians and continuity to the land is not a reactionary thing, Matt.
No, I mean, that's fine. It's not a problem. It shouldn't be like a major.
It's to show that the myths that are being used to say that you're Arabs, if you keep talking about Arabs, you're actually helping the Zionists because they insist on calling you an Arab. You know, and I don't mind being called an Arab, but I think you have to do it with the consciousness of what the other people are doing it with what intention in order to be able to be aware and not fall into the same trap.
People are aware of that, yeah.
Joshua, and then Vijay,
Yeah,
and then Charlie.
I just have a general question for the panel, and I just thought of this in the context of references to South Africa and the university movements in the States in the primarily in the 80s that I'm familiar with, specifically around the adjacent issue of divestment. And I'm wondering how much evidence there is for university direct investment in Israel, in the United States, so American university investment in Israel, and what the prospects are for a strong divestment movement on American campuses.
There is I don't know if you know TIAA Craft, there's a divestment movement that a number of organizations in the States are working on. I don't know if you've read about this.
No, I haven't.
I think Jewish Voices for Peace, Adela, New York, some other organizations have been working on that, specifically for faculty. The other issue that you're talking about has been, they've been working on it on several campuses, unfortunately not successful yet, but UC Berkeley, UC San Diego, UC...
Hampshire College.
Hampshire College, yeah. I mean, they're the first, but, sorry, yeah. But, huh? They were the first, but there's other ones that have been coming up and that people are working on. But also California State right now, there are a number of people with US ACB working on a statewide divestment initiative to get it on the ballot, so.
On the divestment issue, there's actually a very broad movement for divestment, including through some of the American churches. There have been a number of churches who, in their pension plans and various other financial arrangements, have argued for and in fact themselves divested from Israel. We have a divestment movement, and unfortunately it hasn't been successful yet, but it's something on which people continue to work. The TIAA craft movement, which does indeed go well beyond faculty, because they're non-faculty people who also belong to TIAA craft, that's very active. I think that's something that has considerable possibility for ongoing success. I'm old enough to remember and was involved in the divestment movement in South Africa, and for a long time we did not feel we were getting anywhere. And so I think that may well be an approach which has some long-term success, hopefully not too far in the future.
But I think it's even the divestment. It's so slow. I mean, you can count on your fingers the number of colleges that have actually, signed on anyway. And even slower is the academic and cultural boycott. I think that's just much more vexed than the divestment. So I hate to be the naysayer in this, but.
But is there a student discussion and involvement as well that you are aware of, or is it?
Yeah, I mean the stuff I was talking about, the Hampshire College and also the California stuff. I wasn't necessarily saying the other employees. I guess I should have made that clear. But in terms of the stuff on the campuses, those are student-led. Okay. All of those. And actually, UC Berkeley I think is a very interesting case because they have a website and they've got a lot of videos. They were filming all of the debates and the discussion. And while it didn't pass, and it was very close, I think the debates that they were having were really kind of unprecedented, and really, I think we can learn a lot from watching that discussion and seeing what the students were, arguing
And also related to that, and just to sort of dialogue with Malini a bit, I think that that's really where it's at, again, to shift the campus climates is to actually start raising the questions. NYU, I think it was just a few months ago, and if somebody can correct me if you're from NYU, I know there are people in the room, at least 270 faculty all signed on to a really, really strong letter that could be used as a template. It's so nuts and bolts, and it's so well crafted, and I mean, that's something that I want to do at Wesleyan, and just start going to people one-on-one, not to a list, and not in a group email where there's, people start firing off, but to actually just literally reach out to faculty that I know and trust one-on-one and say, would you be willing to sign on to this, and to start to raise the discussion, because I know that at a small place like Wesleyan that only has 300 tenure lines, even if I got 25 people together, it would just shift in terms of the campus discussion and climate to even be able to raise the question publicly, because we've got about 5 incredibly rabid Zionists on campus that shut down student activism, and we have a brand new SJP that's just revived, so hopefully some things can happen with that as well.
EJ?
Yeah, I wanted to I come from a political tradition which likes to declare victories, then recast the struggle and move forward. And I actually think that we are not as weak as you're portraying it. I mean, the Israeli government, more than any other government, is ferociously terrified of its image problem. Brand Israel, Israel as a startup nation. They promote this idea of Israel as and any tarnishing of the brand, like a good corporation, worries the establishment greatly. So Peter Beinart had that fine essay about how younger Jewish Americans are not drinking the Zionist Kool-Aid. And there's a problem there. And I mean, my president of my college signed that letter. Asked what was this about. The pressure was intense on them. So we are actually having a huge impact, disproportionate to the numbers, disproportionate to how many campuses sign on. And I think we need to be aggressive based on this victory that it's on the table. So now, having declared victory, then this is an issue people have in mind. Let 5 faculty vociferously say it's a terrible idea. The issue is finally on the table. I participated in the South Africa struggle. It didn't go so slowly. Why? Because if you keep declaring victory, you build confidence. If we keep speaking from weakness, we don't build confidence of people around us. So we have already declared, we should declare 5 victories and build on that and not speak from a position of defensiveness.
Just to build on it, there's a great article that's on the USACP website, 2011 Successes of the Cultural Boycott, and it's a number of pages. There's quite a number. Charlotte and then Mark.
I'm going to ask my questions, but if you want to come back to them, that's fine, because I don't want to slow the momentum of that. But the first one is for Mesh. I was wondering, when you mentioned about, sometimes people are having questions about, well, what if someone comes in through Israel rather than Jordan, and that these are details that keep people from joining the boycott and participating. And my question for you is, where is the line between, because it's not just meant to be symbolic. There are symbols, you build education around it, but to have a material impact. So where is the line between, the exceptions that get made? For me, it's also like logistical, and then thinking about, well, what does solidarity actually mean in those cases? And then my other question, I don't know, it's not a great fully formed question, but for Kehlani and Malini, that I'm just thinking about how Kehlani, how you talked about analogies and sort of the uses and pitfalls of that, and then at the end of Malini, your talk about the Occupy movement and students sort of analogizing U.S. students to Palestinians a bit, but what do you do with the way that Occupy is used in this really sort of just really ignorant way about that Wall Street is already occupied, that it's all around indigenous sovereignty issues in the United States. Just wondering if you guys could speak to that at all.
Sorry, could you clarify what you said about the Occupy
Well, I
being
guess,
an indigenous?
yeah, I mean, just so that the slogan Occupy Wall Street, not Palestine, just really ignores the fact that the United States is a settler colonial society like Israel already, right? And so how do we, what are the things you're taking away from that, and how do you sort of take those, I guess, take the useful parts without letting that sort of go by uncontested? I don't know. I'm still sort of thinking about the question, but.
No, I mean, there are problems like you suggested, but I think it's very powerful to bring those kind of things together, to make people think about the fact that there are, as we know, enormous financial kind of connections between the U.S. and forces in Israel that are occupying Palestine, and to not be able to somehow ignore those connections completely, I think is a problem. So even though, I mean, there might be a specter of, yes, they're ignoring certain kinds of issues, I think it's to build on what they bring together. To me, I think it's a useful thing to do. And I mean, if you look at the real specifics, like what the example I gave, it is very interesting how, and I think through this conference I've seen other talks also, how, for example, security apparatuses in the occupied territories and in the U.S., how much of a connection there is. It is pretty amazing. So I think I kind of think that there's a power to that kind of synergy, no matter how problematic something like Occupy Wall Street might be. Mark?
Yeah, actually, really quick, El-Amine, who had opened up our performance yesterday, he wrote a really powerful article for the Times called The Occupy Language, which was about the history of how Occupy actually really meant to have sex with originally. So what would that mean, Occupy Wall Street? Just how the words changed in public discourse over centuries, and how we end up in these arguments when people are still continually reinventing language every day.
And Occupy is also, I mean, it has a history in the labor movement as well. It's not just a colonial thing.
Two, I think, questions in 1.2 kind of continue what Vijay was saying. With Cal actually didn't fail. Cal passed the divestment, and then it was vetoed by the president. And it fell one vote short of overturning the veto. And remembering the first divestment vote back in 2001 when SJP occupied the Chancellor's building, you wouldn't get anywhere near even a majority on the first vote. So in terms of victories, we were having conversations on the ground in San Diego that the idea you could even bring up to a table and have the possibility of something pass in a time span of 10 years shows how much discourses change on the ground for people and how much potential and possibility is now open. I think what that brings to me is this question of really, as an artist, this idea, again, that word branding. What would you all like to see, or what could you contribute to the ideas of branding, the BDS movement, and branding, the human rights in terms of most of the Israeli economy is really in the branding of Israel. You have the military arm, and then you have the public discourse, and all the money that goes into movies and academia and the books and the children's book. It's branding, 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 branding. And we're having conversations in really academic hegemonic language that my people in the streets ain't reading, but they are watching, a lot of movies. So really, what do you see for possibilities in terms of BDS and branding? And then for me, when I originally signed on to BDS, I was working in Watts. And I think one of the things that I'd like to ask is, how come BDS, in terms of the academic boycott, do you feel that there's really not an engagement with high school teachers, junior high teachers, and elementary teachers, that we engage in this idea of academic discourse only on a university level, and we're not including our communities?
I think just quickly, by the way, I think we should I think like focusing too much on institutions and states and governments, it's not helpful for the Palestinian question and for any other question. I think we need to focus on people and communities and movements, be engaged with them as much as we want them to be engaged with us, and not to worry too much about like if the president is with me or not, you know. And all the energy that we spend on institutions, including these campaigns that the SGP does, with all the respect, just too much energy spent on something useless. We know they will not change. This, I mean, it's good to be positive about, you know, our power to challenge and so on, but to be realistic about the structure of the U.S. and how it's so much linked to Israel. There is no way the institutions in the U.S., government or universities, will change position on Israel. It's impossible. So what we need to focus on is focus on people and communities in the U.S. that we think there is common causes between us, and focus on other places than the U.S., to be honest. We need to focus on people and history whose histories are closer to us. We need to focus on, for example, if we are in Lebanon, on people who are working in Lebanon coming from other places, economic migrants who could be good allies for the Palestinians. We could focus on places like regions like Asia and Africa, Latin America, that we have already some ground of commonality between them based on our experiences, and I think over time these are the powers that will change, make the shift. Focusing on the US, on making Berkeley divest from Israel, or on the president of Berkeley, it's a loss, it's too much energy spent on something. In my view, it's impossible. But even if you get the student union and Berkeley, the government, votes for boycott, they will change the laws to make Berkeley continue, or they will find a way to continue the money to be challenged to Israel. It's impossible to disconnect Israel from the US. We need to get away from that. The connections are too strong for us to change them. And we need to focus on the people in the US, on the communities in the US, who are suffering from that system. If there is a connection between that linkage and the problems that the US has in wars, in economy, and everything else, we need to focus on that, not on the structure itself that's impossible to work for us or for the people in the US.
I wanted to respond to Charlotte's question and comment, but first I want to make it really explicit, because this is on videotape, and Robert Warrior would be really upset, I think, if I didn't make it 100% clear that he endorses the US ACB. In terms of the language of occupation, I mean, there have been several things written about it, and a lot of interventions made, especially by indigenous activists who feel that the actual language is prohibitive, that it's actually demeaning in a way that it isn't just nomenclature. Whereas other people say, you know, stop splitting hairs, we're all fighting the same battle. And indigenous critique of Occupy Wall Street and all its manifestations is, if we don't get to actually the root of the issue, which is tied up in colonialism, that the corporation itself is tied up in colonialism, then this is another liberal project. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that, and Mark, you raised the question about branding, right? Occupy Wall Street is a brand that was brought in by Adbusters, right?
Yeah.
And that's Canadian. So there's this kind of thread in terms of critiquing it. But one of the things that's interesting is that when I've raised it as an issue, and there's a lot of activists and or scholars all over who've done this. Joanne Barker has done an amazing amount of work in her blog Tequila Sovereign, and she is Lenape. She is indigenous to Wall Street. She's talked about the construction of the wall that used to be at Wall Street that was erected by the Dutch to beat back the English and the Lenape people. But what that gets to is something bigger in the United States, which is there's no broad acknowledgement that the United States is a settler colonial state. Because you still have people talking about it, you know, in American exceptionalist terms, still narrating it as a nation of immigrants. Oh, except slavery, right? You know, and, oh, except Mexico. Oh, except, oh yeah, wait, Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii. They don't even know about the, you know, American Samoa. And like, who remembers the Philippines, right, or the Virgin Islands? And nobody really knows the story of Hawaii. They just know there might have been a queen sometime. But part of this is that unless you're living in a state like New Mexico or Arizona or maybe Washington or maybe Minnesota, how many people in the U.S. even know the tribal name of the place where they reside, right? Unless they're right adjacent to a reservation, most people that live in the so-called United States actually don't even know the name of the people whose homeland that they're on, whether that group is still there as a collective entity or not. They just don't know, and so there's that constant erasure. And for me, that was one of the problems with the opening talk that we had right before the reception at the conference, when the speaker actually delineated sort of, I thought, valorizing the U.S. as a model that people are aspiring to by evoking citizenship rights, republicanism, and then, wait for it, decolonization and meaningful sovereignty. And then it was rephrased as perfect sovereignty. If we're going to say that the U.S. has perfect sovereignty, that is the deepest erasure of indigenous sovereignty in the entire Americas. And part of that has to do with the occupation. When tribal people in the U.S. say, those that know enough about Palestine and support say, okay, wait, not Occupy Wall Street, not the sign that says Occupy Wall Street, not Palestine. And you hear an indigenous critique from an American Indian perspective that says, wait, hold on. People go, well, it's not the same. And it is and it isn't the same, right? It's not laws of occupation in terms of belligerent occupation under international law that Hawaiians and Palestinians are talking about, but there's all kinds of occupations, right? And so part of that Joanne has brought up is that there's not anybody holding title to their home, their mortgage, their campus, the airport, the shopping mall that isn't clouded title because of the nature of land confiscations that undergird the state. So I just wanted to mention that, and I think that that's part of the shift in consciousness that needs to happen, to not just dismiss it. And of course, there are different cities that have changed the name to de-occupy Albuquerque or decolonize. But it's interesting because early on, different cities were willing to pass a memorandum of solidarity with indigenous peoples. And that wasn't that big of a deal. Like Boston did it, Austin did it, Portland did it. But when the name got challenged, there was a throwdown showdown. Like Oakland had a dirty battle over it where people just were like, no, it's too late. It's like, what does that mean? What does that actually mean? What does that say?
I was going to say, Oakland actually, the consensus is what came up, is that actually 69% voted for the shift to decolonize, for the name shift at the General Assembly. The voting at Oakland for pasture was 90% for consensus, 80% for friendly amendment. That it wouldn't get up to the 80%, so it failed. Seattle only got up to 45%. And it wasn't several, it was only originally occupied Albuquerque that became decolonized Albuquerque. It was the only successful one in the entire US. All the others didn't even come up. So from my understanding, there were only those 3 cities that even tried.
Rayhan?
I'm not sure if it's a good time to shift things to the Arab world in terms of the conversation, because I know that a lot of people here work and live and teach in the United States. But considering what's happening in the Arab world, considering this, huge transformation, we're calling it revolts and not Arab Spring here, and hopefully revolutions eventually. But considering this huge shift that's happening politically and socially in the Arab world, I'd like to kind of send this back to Majid. What are the opportunities? I mean, one of the most, the brightest moments that I saw over the last couple of months, or 6 months, specifically in Egypt, when the revolution, where people came and attacked the Israeli embassy. That was like one of the most incredible moments for me personally, and took down the flag several times, and we're making the statement, about Israel, in a very emphatic and a concrete way. And it's a reaction to also what the mainstream pundits like Thomas Friedman and others have been saying in the United States, that you know, the Arab streets and the Arab revolts has nothing to do with foreign policy. They're not that sophisticated, you know. And so the idea is that there's an opportunity here in the Arab world. I think that other than me and Alex, I think we're the only ones that live in Lebanon. Everybody else is from outside. Thinking about like the opportunities to take back, you know, the normalization that's happened as a result of dictators, you know, over, you know, the last few decades in the Arab world. And that would be important for me. I know that's a strategic question. Things are still up in the air, but that's what's important to me.
Ajit, do you want to respond?
No, it's not a question. He just made a statement. I think it's important. We talked about it a bit, but I think it's totally, I agree with it completely.
Also, just Mark, as a point of reference, just because only 3 cities voted on it doesn't mean that's the only place it's come up. It came up, it's been up in New York City at Wall Street nonstop since the beginning. What it means is that indigenous people have said, fuck this, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
You know, and so people are feeling alienated, and they don't have the critical mass in terms of demographics to push the issue.
Salah? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, before he said it, and then you made the comment about the cultural boycott. Cultural boycott's been very successful, very successful. And it's not just by numbers. I think we should count it, or even the names on the list. I mean, there's just the level of education that's been done around this issue in ways that other issues, I mean, other approaches haven't really been able to open up the discussion and get, you know, I actually think that there's been significant movement in the last 10 years in the US around this issue, to the point where people I know who, you know, didn't know anything, really anything about Israel and Palestine, now are see themselves as solidarity activists. I mean, it's, and I'm not talking about students, I'm talking about people who, you know, part of it has to do with their mobilization around Iraq. And then, you know, that sort of led them into Israel and Palestine also, especially in 2008, 2009. But I don't think that's all that, I think that the timing has been really good for the discussion of boycott and divestment. But I do think that the work that was being done even before, and I don't think the apartheid South Africa case was that fast, actually, BJ. It took a long time, and you know, from like Soweto up through the end of apartheid. I mean, that's 25 years or 15 years, right? So, I mean, it's going to take some time, but I think that in a short period, in this last 10 years, when actually conditions have been not very good in some ways in the US because of the war on terror, there actually has been a huge amount of ground covered, especially given the disarray in Palestinian politics.
Yeah, did you have your hand up?
I'm sorry. Let me just add a little bit on to that, because I've been thinking about this question of what's going on in the US too, and first of all, you know, if you, those people who study the relationships between the US and Israel extensively, the real slavish intimacy period is really post-60s. And so it's not that long in a certain sense. I mean, you can make a lot of discursive connections back to the founding, but the connections to the military state of Israel, that is a relatively recent phenomenon, and it's undergone a really radical change, along with changes in what we'll call Grand Israel. I mean, there have been, and in the last, 10 years, there have been radical splits in the Jewish community that have also made possible a certain openness to do discussions of Palestine. And that was not the case, I think, 10 years ago. And it is the case now. That said, it is unquestionably true that there are huge institutions and a great deal of political and cultural power mobilized against it. But I do think, I agree with this point, fellow scholar over here, that something has changed, and that there is a significant moment of opening. And I also do think that the progress of the divestment movement, especially outside the academy. I mean, I am not a religious person, but I've been very struck by the willingness or the eagerness of certain mainstream American denominations to separate themselves from Israel. That also seems to me to be a real rather stunning development, and to do so financially. That also seems to me to be something new, and I think declaring at least a small victory on that front is cause for some hope.
I think, like, I was talking about like state-to-state institutions. The linkage is definitely evolving to the worse. You know, it's not getting better. I mean, the political discourse in the US on an official level is worse today than it was like 60 years ago. So the linkages between Israel and the US are like getting stronger as far as like state-to-state institutions to institutions. Now, definitely, this is different than from the Republic, the society, the French, which is a different issue. Definitely, there is a shift, and there's also like more awareness and more engagement with the question of Palestine on the public level. But whatever you look at it, you know, any measure you want, economic like cooperation, religious cooperation, on all levels, the state-to-state is, and also it's impossible to really have the US as a government change its position in Israel. I don't believe that. I think that's so much connected, in many ways, not just the Jewish lobby. The similarities of the criminality of the two structures, the project that is connected together, is so hard to disconnect unless the US deconstructs itself, or it kind of changes its own nature, which is, states don't do that. They're just, you know, they continue the pattern, how they start. I don't think it's possible unless major shock happens from outside that makes that state changes its pattern. You need that to happen. Until then, I think we need to, like again, to focus only on people. And definitely there is a change. If you look at not only the culture of boycott, even the question of academics taking position on Palestine. It's different today than it was before. I mean, even the 500, those who signed, this is a new thing. Academics openly take position on Palestine to boycott Israel. It's quite a new thing. So there is a change on individual level, but not on institutions. Like, you know, I don't really think we should invest in that. Like invest our energy on changing that.
I'm going to get to you, Alex. I just want to say one thing that is, like, for people who don't know, and it is related, that one of the more disturbing things, and I don't think we have anyone from Cornell here, but Cornell University now has a partnership with Technion University to, you know, to have some kind of technical school in New York City. Technion, one of the companies that they are partnered with the most is El-Amine Systems, which works to build the wall on both the U.S.-Mexico border and in Palestine. So, I mean, and we came up with a statement as U.S. ACBI, and we circulated it, and I contacted the 4 Cornell scholars who are on our list, and you know, no one seems to be up in arms or wanting to mobilize around this issue. So, I mean, there is the signing, which we want, and we want more people, but partially what I personally want more people for is when something like this happens, we try to figure out what to do about it.
I'm talking about like institutions definitely are connected together. They will help each other. I mean, Israel is not built by anything else but that support that gets through institutions and governments. Now, that's not going to change. I'm talking about people taking position on Palestine. It's something openly so, it's something new. And not only academics, all kinds of people, artists and so on. It wasn't in the past. It's a new thing.
Yeah.
And if Cornell does something with the Technion, this is not a new thing. I mean, all Israeli projects are funded and based on collaboration with American institutions. And all technology that Israel creates, all this, you know, Israel developed technology, it's based on projects that financed by the US, and also the know-how is US.
Absolutely, but this is...
So there is nothing new in Cornell.
It's new in the sense that we have this movement, and we should, in theory, have it.
But there are all kinds of agreements between different universities today. Like while we're speaking, I'm sure there's something new is being signed between Israeli universities and American
For sure.
universities. It's not like something new. It's not an exception.
Alex, and then we'll have to close.
Yeah, just a really short comment. I think, and Majid speaks very well for himself, but I think that there's something very subtle and a point that he's making that I think I would like to emphasize too, in which I think this conference has something important to say, which is that we need to recognize the importance of the United States as an imperial power, but let's not center the United States as the most important entity in a global history of decolonization. At the same time, as we're talking about BDS, let's not center Jews and their transformation in the last 5 years in the history of anti-Israel, anti-Zionist work. That's what I'm going to say.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.